extraocular vision. In 1982, the Mexican television company Televisa invited me to participate in a direct program that would deal with an unusual type of vision. My presence was required to judge the veracity of the phenomenon as a researcher in neurophysiology and professor at the National University. I agreed, and in the study, I found about 20 children talking animatedly as they prepared for the demonstration. Once the school had begun, their instructor, Professor Altamirano, blindfolded the children and put a series of photographs on them. The boy touched them with the palms of his hands, describing at the same time what he saw. Intrigued, I approached and could see that the description matched the content of the artwork perfectly. Later, other children were subjected to the same process, and in all cases, they were correct in their descriptions. I could find neither mistakes nor attempts at deception in the process. At the end of the program, I proposed to Altamirano that he use his procedures to help blind children see with their hands. Altamirano agreed, as did the government department in charge of the education of blind children. For several months we tried to instruct these children extraocular vision, but without success. Once a week Altamirano would come to the school for the blind, lock himself in with the children and then leave. I never knew if the failure was due to the sporadic nature of the training regimen or to the brief time that the entire process lasted. Nor could I receive detailed instructions on the technique used, because Professor Altamirano kept it secret, of course. Several years later, during a sabbatical, I decided to devote myself for 6 months to teaching children in a primary school in Cuernavaca, 70 kilometers from Mexico City. They allowed me to try different alternative techniques of education to be evaluated. One morning, while we were resting in the school garden, a little girl told me that she had seen a television program showing extraocular vision skills and asked me to show them to her. Although I did not feel capable, because I did not know the technique of extraocular vision, but I remembered some of the comments of the blind children and I decided to give it a chance and try it for the girl. I asked her to relax, focus on her breathing, and try to visualize a light between her eyebrows. Then I took her hands and asked her to imagine a luminous line interconnecting her fingers with her eyebrows. I placed her palms on a color picture after blindfolding her, and the girl described the information in the picture to me. Other children approached to us. In less than an hour, 6 or 7 children were seeing extraocularly. We were all in love with the experience, so we continued it for several months, until both the school principal and the parents forbade us to continue the experiments because the parents were able to give up their thoughts to the children's, and the children starts moving objects at a distance, and beginning to reaffirm their entire worldview. The same experience has been repeated with identical results in another school in the city of Toluca, this time with the support of parents and school administrators. What follows is a description of the experience of Cuernavaca, written with the greatest possible number of details and with the purpose that those who wish to do so can put it into practice. 19 subjects were studied, 11 girls and 8 boys, aged between 5 and 13 years. All of them, without exception, were in good health and said they were eager to participate in it. None of them had a history of extraocular vision or any experience of this type of phenomenon. They belonged to 6 different schools. In all of them they were very restless and especially reluctant to accept rigid rules of discipline and conduct. Otherwise, they were categorized as highly intelligent and alert. Although family conditions varied from child to child, no notable differences were observed, except for an appreciable initial skill in 5 girls and 2 boys with a situation of family stability optimal. Initial learning. Prior to the initiation of the extraocular vision detection experiments, all children received an apprehension that lasted between 1 and 3 days and was repeated in all subsequent testing sessions from the initials. In this way, each child was sensitized before and throughout the course of the experiment, until he or she acquired a structure automated enough not to require additional training. The characteristics of learning are explained below in the same sequence in which it was developed. With the child sitting comfortably with his back straight, the following 3 breathing exercises were performed. A. Forced expulsion of air through the nostrils for 60 seconds, with the eyes closed, followed by a concentration of attention between the eyebrows for 20 seconds. B. Alternate breathing through each of nostrils for 60 seconds, with the eyes closed, followed by concentration of attention between the eyebrows for 20 seconds. C. Forced inhalation and exhalation of air, in a rhythmic and sustained manner, to the limit of each child. Then, in the same posture, the child practiced meditation according to the following instructions. With your eyes closed, focus on your eyebrows, and let your thoughts flow without obstructing or controlling them. Once you accomplish the above, focus on yourself and ask yourself, who am I? Feeling yourself. Keep your focus on yourself for as long as possible. The verbalization of the above instructions was appropriate to each child's level of understanding. The total time of each meditation varied from child to child, with a minimum of 5 to 6 minutes and a maximum of 10 to 13 minutes. Once the previous fist was achieved, the instructor would sit in front of the child and intertwine his hands with the child's, visualizing a line of light that emerged from the palms of the child's hands and ended in his brain. The exercise continued until the image of the line of light was bright, white, and uninterrupted. Sometimes the tip of a quartz crystal held by the instructor was placed in contact with the child's eyebrow or close to it. It was found that this procedure improved learning and accelerated the extraocular vision process. Then the extraocular detection phase began. To do this, the child was blindfolded using a special bandage that was completely opaque and tied to the eyelids, in such a way that retinal vision was impossible. The child was provided with graphic material consisting of high-quality photographs in bright colors and with a variety of contents. The trainer placed one or both child's hands on the photograph, making dermal contact with the surface of the photograph, and asked him to follow his intuition both in terms of the rhythmic exploration of the photograph and in terms of the photograph, to the exploration of the mental content stimulated by it. Then it was suggested that he give a detailed account of all his experiences. Later, he was given verbal feedback about the details of the photograph and about the points of correspondence between his description of the figure and the content of the photograph. Using natural and spontaneous expressions of wonder and pleasure, the instructor reinforced the proper correspondences and corrected the inappropriate ones. The feedback process continued until the child showed signs of fatigue or interest. In the latter cases, the training was suspended to be continued on another occasion. The child was stimulated to use all kinds of movements with his hands, thus exploring different possibilities. When the child was able to write the figures contained in the photographs without error, he was asked to remove his hands from the surface of the photographs and to try to visualize their contents without dermal contact. Later, he was taught to perform sweeping motions in the space between his body and photographs using rapid contractions of his fingers. The procedure focused on details and improved focusing, as well as the distance limit at which the child could still distinguish subtle shapes, such as printed letters. Finally, The child was stimulated to stop using his hands completely and to see the contents directly without the aid of movements. Many graphic materials were used: color photographs of landscapes, vegetables, fruit and household utensils, conventional books with linguistic content and television programs, as well as other children and environmental objects. The children were also asked to walk around the school, kindergarten, classrooms, etc., by writing down what they saw. Guarantees of veracity. A phenomenon as novel and bizarre as extraocular vision requires to be both accepted and demonstrated controls about its characteristics. Although I do not claim to have exhausted all possibilities of studying the phenomenon, I can affirm that I have no doubt about its existence. It will suffice here to mention some of the controls conducted to encourage other researchers to take an interest in this phenomenon and to conduct studies on their own. The bandage used was constantly examined to rule out any possibility of accidental and imperceptible breakage that would result from any, however minimal, degree of retinal vision. No deficiency to any was ever found in the bandage. The material offered to the child was continually changing, so that no child could predict what material would be offered. Since one of the possible explanations of the phenomenon is that the instructor transmits the contents using movements, sounds, or any other conscious or unconscious means, particular care was taken to intersperse contents graphics that the instructor did not know or see during the presentation. In the same way, other children were asked to function as instructors, varying the content of the materials used. In no case could it be shown that the instructor sent subtle messages. Moreover, since in cases of knowledge of the material the latter was impossible, the transmission factor can be ruled out as an explanation for the phenomenon. When the trainee reached the stage of direct vision without the use of hands, the children were placed in a pitch-black basement, where they were asked to write objects. None of the 4 witnesses used in this check could have been seen as an object. On the other hand, 2 of the trained children were able to see them without difficulty. This control questions the possibility that the energetic medium encoded by children is photonic in nature, at least at the thresholds of retinal vision. The above control addresses the issue of extraocular versus retinal sensitivity. Although strict measurements of values were not conducted, a reading ability test was conducted and was enriching. One of the children was instructed to read printed material of different dimensions and at different distances. With letters 1 mm in size, the child began to show difficulties in extraocular coding at about 70 centimeters away without the use of manual barcodes. In this limit, it was suggested to use the sweep. By doing so, the child was able to read the material without difficulty and even increase the separation of his body from the printed matter by another 30 centimeters. The same child, the instructor, and 3 other children showed difficulty reading retina at the same distance and with the same font size as those used in extraocular vision. This shows that the thresholds between the 2 types of vision are similar in terms of size and distance from the decodable elements. A conventional mirror was used to study the possibility of extraocular vision of reflected objects. Printed material was placed at a 4 or 5 degree angle to the mirror and the child was asked to describe it. He described not only the printed material, but also other objects reflected in the mirror that had gone unnoticed by the researcher. The control was conclusive and ruled out the possibility that it was a thermal or calorific field that was decoded in the extraocular vision. A 5 mm pane of glass was placed between the graphic material and the child. In all cases, extraocular vision developed without difficulty. On the other hand, when the material was covered with a white sheet of paper or with a wooden lacquer, The children saw the leaf or the wood and not the material they hid. On one occasion, a child was asked to perform manual sweeping movements on graphic material. Between the child's hands and body, a wooden lacquer was placed, so that the hands were not obstructed by it, but the body was. The boy was unable to penetrate the graphic material extraocularly, but he wrote the wooden plate perfectly. This control shows that the mediators of the extraocular phenomenon are not receptors located in the hands, but the rest of the body is necessary. Following the logic of the previous control, it was decided to explore the body areas that mediate extraocular vision. On 5 of the children, an opaque loaf of bread was placed under their chins during the exercise of extraocular vision. In 4 cases the image disappeared. In the remaining case, the child continued to perceive the photograph correctly but was tempered by the color of the shutter screen, which was red. To achieve greater accuracy in the localization of the body area that mediates extraocular vision, another more complex procedure was used with one of the most advanced children. The boy's body was placed behind a metal plate and his head behind a 6 mm glass plate, which was used as a window for the presentation of color prints. The boy was perfectly bandaged, exposing his forehead, chin, nose, and cheekbones. His hands and arms were obstructed by the metal plate. Under these conditions, the child described the material presented without difficulty. Then the child's forehead was completely covered, and the material was put back on. There was no alteration at all, nor did it happen when covering her cheekbones and nose. However, when he covered his mouth, a clear decrease in the skill of detection was noticed. The child began to manifest difficulties and to make mistakes. When the chin was covered, the child completely ceased to perish. However, the case is neither typical nor generalized. In the same child as in others, the critical zone varied over time, so it is not possible to accurately determine the existence of an indispensable and specific body area to mediate extraocular vision. An illustrative example of this was a 6-year-old girl. This girl, extraordinarily wake-up and active, learned to see extraocularly in the second session of her training and soon showed exceptional skills to develop this activity. To confirm this circumstance, he submitted it to her to diverse tests. First, she was presented with graphic materials by placing them on her back. Not only was she able to identify the material, but she was even able to read printed words and phrases. Using a pair of gourd goggles in such a way as to completely impede eye vision, the girl was invited to walk freely in a field in Mexico City, describing everything she could see. In the beginning cautiously, but at once completely uninhibited, the girl walked around the country, describing the trees, the benches, the children, the dogs, the peddlers, and the rest of the uninhibited elements without difficulty. The most astonishing thing about the experience was not only the accuracy and ease of the description, but that it reflected an omnidirectional perception. In other words, the girl wrote both what was in front of her and what was behind her. Inside view of the human body. Both the girl mentioned in the previous case and her brother were able to perceive the organs inside the human body. The training was entirely like that of writing, except that the focus of attention was located not on the surface, but in the depths of the body. Both children were able to describe the specific characteristics and state of interpretation in a case of pulmonary emphysema. 3 other children were able to locate and detail their exact dimensions, bone fractures that fell in the past several years. The descriptions of the scars on the bones matched those offered by the victims. 2 children volunteered to try to relieve the pain and lessen the ear infection of 2 adults. The children were trained to see inside the body and locate alterations in it. Both were able to recognize the left side as infected in both cases. They said they perceived a strange coloration in their ears and proceeded to transform that coloration until they brought it close to that of the healthy patient. Patients reported immediate improvement, which took an average of 3 days. One of the adults, father of the children, repeated the operation several times, noticing the same result in all of them, with a similar duration. All the children learned to use their extraocular vision skills to perceive areas of the body affected by pain or tissue problems. The children were able to describe organs without the aid of any anatomy manual. They located altered areas spontaneously, as if they were emitting signals that were easily recognizable and discriminable by them. In cases of infection, the children were able to destroy the pathogenic agents by emitting large amounts of energy from their fingers. Especially in the youngest children, a slight lateral movement of the head was observed, which was tilted between 20 degrees and 30 degrees to the right or left side in a plane parallel to that of the object tags. The impression that emerged from the tilting movement was that the child's body was looking for a closer interaction between the right or left hemisphere and the material to be coated. At the beginning of the training, it was found that the child followed the outlines of the objects and letters with his fingers now when the description began. This observation was repeated in all the cases studied and constituted an elucidation about the existence of a bodily wisdom that was later verbalized. Conclusions. Much of the results have already been written in the previous sections. For this reason, I will try to integrate all the results obtained without dwelling on unnecessary details and procedures. The clearest and most basic result to emerge from this study is that it is possible to lose visually without the need to use the eyes and retinal receptors. The fineness of the size of extraocular vision appears to be like that of retinal vision, as does its fidelity. Extraocular vision can represent a visual world entirely like that of retinal vision without the need to use the colossal complexity of the retinal structure and without the involvement of retinal scientists. Brain structures commonly responsible for encoding the visual world. One of the most striking observations, and one of the first to be evidenced, is that the children who were most in touch with themselves, the most secure and intense in their personal identity, were the children who were more in touch with themselves, who more easily acquired extraocular vision. The phenomenon exists and its development seems to follow a logical sequence repeated in the cases studied. Children who, after their training, are confronted with graphic material to which they have no visual access, use their hands and fingers to go through this material to decode it. In the most skillful cases, a session is enough for the child to begin to see extraocularly. In common cases, 3 sessions. In its first interaction, the hand begins by sweeping the page of the paper without a predictable pattern until it contains something that makes the outlines of the objects be patterned. If the photograph contains a slot, the child's hand will follow the outline of the slot for a few seconds, but if the child is asked what he feels, he will not be able to describe it congruently. To be sure, there is no such thing as a manual sweep. If the child is made to ignore this, he may suddenly realize that there must be a round object, but the extraocular vision still does not appear. Soon, the boy gets tired of his movements and decides to stop doing them. He stands still with his hand on the paper, focused on his sensations and with a tendency to tilt his head. In some cases, after this concentration the phenomenon appears. In others, the child must receive more detailed feedback to discard unmatched images and strengthen those that are congruent with the actual material. In one way, extraocular vision always appears in a kind of qualitative quantum leap, from an almost total inability to detect to an almost total perfection of coding. In fact, the whole description above was intended to call attention to a non-characteristic feature of the phenomenon of extraocular vision. It is sudden onset. Once this was done, the child was able to pick up any material that presented itself with an astonishing stature. The first session in which the phenomenon appeared involved a large amount of energy expenditure, because the children showed obvious signs of tiredness and in some cases complained of intense pain in the brain and in the eyes. These pains and the corresponding fatigue diminished by the time of the second detection. In the most advanced cases, extraocular vision would involve an energetic and explosive gas, which the child is able to make detections without further preparation and with total naturalness and mastery. When other children saw the executions of their classmates, they expressed a desire to carry them out on their own. When this happened, the process of apparition of the phenomenon seemed to accelerate. By this statement I intend to point out that the absence of doubt as to the veracity of the phenomenon and the confidence in the instructor exerted a beneficial influence. In what follows, I will describe a series of tests that were conducted to establish to what extent extraocular vision follows the same laws of perspective and gestalt as retinal vision. A child was asked to describe his experiences as the visual material moved away from his body, without the child being aware of the maneuver. Without hesitation, the boy described a phenomenon of shrinking and not of reducing size or changing material. In other words, the child correctly perceived the maneuver as he would have seen it with his retinal vision. Similarly, in all cases where an object was tried to be superimposed on the graph, the children were able to describe the maneuver correctly. When they were presented with moving objects, the detection and interpretation of them was correct in all cases. Experimentation was conducted with all the colors of the spectrum, with different shades of them, and an adequate description of these colors was always observed. Each child manifested a personal style during extraocular vision. A little girl, for example, used to make quick strokes with her fingers in front of the graphic material because it was easier for her and her description more accurate. Another child preferred to read words and not see photographs. Another preferred figures to reading material. The reading of words was exercised gradually, beginning with a detection of isolated letters, and placing a finger below the letter to be read. It only took a few minutes for the child to begin to read whole words, even in languages unknown to them. Later, the speed of reading became like that usual with retinal vision. Two exceptions to the latter case were that of a boy and a girl who read extraocularly more quickly than with retinal vision and who showed more interest in doing so extraocularly. This interest was taken advantage of to encourage them to teach their Spanish reading classes. One of the objectives of this study was to identify a visible manifestation of a psychophysiological capacity to motivate children to develop techniques of contact with their identity. That is why we always emphasis was placed on the need to conduct meditations focused on the experience of the self and the question, "Who am I?" In this context, I am ignorant as to whether other training methods may be more effective than those used in this research. In fact, some children took it upon themselves to train their friends and acquaintances, to exercise their skills on their own, with excellent results. An interesting observation focuses on the most appropriate age to facilitate extraocular vision. Obviously, a much larger sample than the one used here would be needed to answer the question. However, some conclusions can be drawn from the unsuccessful attempts I made with young people over the age of 16 and with older adults. The phenomenon becomes more difficult after an age limit of around 15 years. On occasion, group meditations were conducted in which lights were visualized and contact with oneself was stimulated. Extraocular vision was always provided after a meditation of this type. The phenomenon presents itself more intensely and in a clearer way when both the child and the instructor are calm, concentrated on themselves, at a level at which the self loses boundaries. In other words, when there is genuine contact with a sense of identity that transcends the purely personal. Another interesting observation is that the instructor does not need extraocular vision to teach it. On many occasions, the children were asked about their internal experiences during extraocular vision. Some of them said that what they saw was the same as what they normally saw with their eyes open. In one case, a girl watched television blindfolded, describing perfectly what was happening on the screen, as if the apartment were inside it. Other children wrote of the apparition of a small loaf of bread carving into their minds in which the figures presented appeared. None of the children mentioned that they had to consciously create the extraocular image. Rather, the image arose on its own, in the same way that our normal visual perceptions occur. The automation of extraocular imaging has been clear since the emergence of the phenomenon and does not seem to be significantly facilitated by practice. Instead, what did happen, however, as the child used his or her extraocular vision ability, was that a series of phenomena adjacent to the extraocular vision was stimulated. These phenomena have already been described in paragraph and consisted of a series of phenomena which prevented the child from perishing the internal organs of the body through the skin and from damaging areas of the body or sickness reversing their symptoms. The last result I would like to highlight concerns the relationship between the extraocular phenomenon and quartz crystals. Suffice it to say here that its facilitating effect was observed in at least 5 infants, 3 girls and 2 boys, and that its discovery was accidental. One of the girls in the studio volunteered to demonstrate her ability with a TV program, so she was shown a British film in color, with Spanish subtitles. The girl had some difficulty reading the subtitles at 5 meters from the screen, although she was able to write the colors of the scenes and the dramatized action. He mentioned that there were lines and dots that were visible. Suddenly, the girl asked me for a quartz crystal that I carried with me and that I use in my meditations. Holding the glass in her right hand, the girl signed that the lines and points of distraction had disappeared, and so she was able to read fluently the subtitles of the film and describe them in luxury of the scenes. The effect was so clear that it was then tested on other children. 2 girls claimed that the graphic material presented to them, a series of photographs, acquired 3-dimensionality when it was extraocularly perceived, while a quartz crystal was held between the 2 of them and their hands. It was, they said, as if with the glass they were inside the photograph, in the middle of the landscape, and without the glass, outside of it, observing it as a 2-dimensional photograph. Finally, 2 girls and 2 boys were able to increase the maximum distance at which they could read printed material with the help of quartz crystals.